May it please the court, members of the jury. Time has come. This trial is almost over. You have heard all the testimony, seen all the evidence. The judge has instructed you on the law. In a moment, you are going to be asked to go back in that room and render a verdict. And when you look at all the evidence, all the testimony, there is one conclusion to reach. That Charlene is innocent of the charge of murder. There is simply no blood on her hands. During the voir dire process, we talked about the need to ask questions when reaching an important decision. That you want to have all the information available before you reach a monumental decision. That it's not inappropriate to ask for more information. That you're not going to take someone's word for it. On the end of my opening statement, there was the suggestion that you continue to ask those questions and you hold the state accountable and demand those answers. Questions like, what about Mr. Potter? Well, he saw Charlene and the victim driving towards the bonfire that night, but there was no evidence about any interaction the two of them had once they got to the bonfire. None. Well, what about the fact Charlene and Sarah told the police they got home about 11 that night, and the medical examiner put the time of death at around 11:30. What about the fact that a vehicle matching Paula's description was seen near the bonfire between 11:45 and 12:15? Now, Paula claims that car is at her grandmother's in New Columbia. Something that would be fairly easy to prove, but the state didn't bother to do that. And what about Tara Arnold? She didn't get home till midnight that night. These are all reasonable questions that we don't have the answer to. And it would seem that the state doesn't feel like you need an answer. Because there is that mountain of forensic and scientific evidence that points to Charlene. That's how much forensic evidence points to Charlene. None. Zero. During voir dire, we talked about your want and need and desire to have fingerprints, DNA, hair, fiber. There is none of that points to Charlene. Not one police report, not one lab report. In fact, there is no murder weapon. There's no DNA, no fingerprints from Charlene in this case. Which isn't to say that there isn't forensic evidence involved in this case. There was the bloody towel. It was found about a mile from the crime scene, soaked in the victim's blood, along with hair from the victim and hair from an unknown individual. And when we say unknown individual, it means that we don't know who it is, but we know who it's not. We know it's not Charlene. We know those hairs do not belong to her. And we talk about attention to detail. The state wants to talk about the shock and outrage the community felt around this crime. But that didn't quite translate to attention to detail, because that bloody towel and those hairs, evidence that shows Charlene had nothing to do with this, have now gone missing from the police locker. As we talk about unknown individuals, let's talk about that bloody palm print left at the crime scene. A bloody palm print. The state does not know who that belongs to. We know who it doesn't belong to. We know that that palm print does not belong to Charlene. Perhaps the state would at least try to identify who that bloody palm print belongs to. Maybe even have a conversation with them before they try to convict a young girl of murder. But that bloody palm print does not belong to her. Charlene's hands have no blood on them. And thank goodness for John. If it wasn't for John, we would only think that the conversations between Charlene and the victim were Charlene trying to make amends, trying to put the past pettiness and rivalries of high school in the past, keep them in high school as they graduated and moved forward. Without John's insight, we would only think that Charlene was trying to mature. Without John's telling us of those undertones of that conversation, that secret conversation that only he was privy to, that it was somehow a revelation that Charlene was going to get a ride from the victim that night, despite the fact that Charlene had put it in that big group email that she was going to get a ride from the victim that night. There was nothing secret. There was nothing sinister. Here's what we hope of all of our children, that they mature and become responsible adults who behave like adults. But we can take John's word for it. We can take John's word that there was something sinister, because John has no reason to be dishonest. John has no bias in this case. No. Only because if it wasn't for him pointing the finger at Charlene, there's a very real possibility that the finger would be pointed at him. John would be a very good suspect in this case. The victim had just broken up with John, had just dumped John. She was going off to the big city on a full scholarship, leaving John back home, leaving that small town boy in the small town. John knowing that the best thing that ever happened to him was leaving town. John perhaps coming to the realization that at the age of 18, his best days may very well be behind him. And for all the talk that John does about ignoring Charlene, he didn't ignore that email. He was part of the big group that got that email that they were going to the bonfire that night, about the bonfire. But he went anyway. Maybe to see the victim? Did she spurn him? Spurn his advances? Was she adamant that they were through? That she was leaving town? Leaving him? Did something snap? Reasonable questions that we don't have the answer to. And what about John when he left? John, who said he left maybe around 11. He was goofing off with his friends. He's not exactly sure. He left that little caveat in there in case his timeline needed to be a little bit more flexible. We might have some better idea what time John left if we had heard from any of John's friends, something that would have been relatively easy to do, but we didn't hear that. We don't know what time John left the bonfire. We certainly don't know what time John got home, and we certainly don't know what John did in between. More questions that we don't have the answer to. But yet, it is Charlene who sits on trial for murder today. And the very question before you is simply this. Do you believe beyond a reasonable doubt that it was Charlene that caused the death of the victim? Beyond a reasonable doubt. There is simply no way for you to possibly believe that. The state has not met its burden. Beyond a reasonable doubt, it hasn't even come close. Charlene sits before you, an innocent girl. Charlene sits before you without any blood on her hands. Find Charlene not guilty.